Okay, so we've been studying the tribes and cultures of video game culture. By looking at video games as the mainstay of the culture, not the creators, not the game players, but the games themselves, we can see multiple ways of tribal interaction within video game culture. Last week, or the last video we made was about, or the video I made was about the different generations of people or of video games and how they worked within the tribes. So if you're an NES player, you like a certain type of game and you have a certain feel for, the way the game looks or how it should play. And if you were a PlayStation player, you would actually have a hard time with a Wii because it plays differently from what you expect. In this video, we're going to talk about the tribes and clans within games themselves and how they've altered over the years, and thus we can see, different tribes within them. So here we go. Also, next week, we're going to talk about the tribes of controllers and how those work out. And that's going to be an entire week just because there's a lot more to it than you expect. I honestly expect one video to be talking about a single control scheme for like an hour, and it's going to be one video. That's not a joke, and it's a control scheme I really like, and I've just been fascinated by the way it moves. But anyway, we're going to talk about games and how they create tribes. The first tribal group is called the Exploration Group. And the Exploration Group is probably the oldest because it started way back when there was only text to work with. And on the left, you see a picture of a MUD. This is actually a fairly advanced MUD, by the way. And MUD stands for Multi-User Dungeon. This is multiple players at the same time exploring a dungeon and finding enemies and finding loot and trying to work with each other to do things. And they're actually opening up trade, and there's multiple dungeons and multiple lands to explore, and they kind of create this entire ecosystem. There are people who have been playing a single MUD for decades. Some of these MUDs have been around since the 70s, and so even into the 90s, my buddy Chris back in high school said that he was meeting people who were putting in hundreds of thousands of hours into these games just because they've been around for so long. Since it's originally text-based, you can just create this basic database of what is where and just go from there. More modern systems into the 80s and 90s created these little maps as you see them, but you have to open them up on your own. And then from there, we can see the MUD or user dungeon, games like, what is it? Well, there's a lot of games like it. And from there, we go into games like Ultima, which was very open world. You explored as the Avatar. You were literally called the Avatar. And you tried to find, understanding through things. And just because there was a puzzle didn't mean that there was a single answer. You just had to hit a switch. And just because the game creator expected you to do a specific thing didn't mean that you had to. You just had to hit a switch. It didn't matter how you did it, as long as you just hit the switch. And so they were always amazed, the game creators, the way a game player would play the game differently from how they expected it. And from Ultima, it inspired hundreds of games, even into the Japanese genre. And from within that, they created Zelda. And Zelda became kind of the standard over-the-head video game. And it became its own kind of genre of this open world that you could explore. And that was the point, is the more you opened it up, the more you explored. And they made a 2D type side-scroller version of it called Metroid. And that was enjoyable. The entire point of Metroid and its ilk were to explore. And so it just kept on getting bigger. And it didn't matter, how they expanded or the way it expanded. You could see it. If you look at the bottom right, this is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the most recent Zelda, most popular game of last year. And if you just look at it very carefully, you can see the same dungeon that you saw in the MUD. Don't you see the little boxes and how they are maneuvered around so that you can only see a few of them. And you're trying to slowly expand and explore and find things. And even though you know where things are and how things work, it doesn't mean that you don't want to explore it more. In fact, now that I think about it, I know exactly where this is. And I'm just like, oh, yeah, that's a fun place. And you want to explore. That's the point. And the more you explore, the more you enjoy the area, and the more it just becomes a natural place for you. Between here and there was games like Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. It's an open world, but you see the same boxes. Every block is a different box. Then you go into games like, others. We're going to discuss another genre a little bit later, but the open world is entirely about exploration, and every single version has kind of its own tribe to it. You have the Zelda tribe. Breath of the Wild is basically the Zelda tribe, but they're also the Ultima tribe, and also, the Grand Theft Auto tribe, though not as dark. And you can just kind of see that, it's this same game style, the same point of the game is right there, and you can understand it. Then we have the single screen to Metroidvania. This is the 2D side-scroller. And the reason why I said, there's games that are based on kind of this exploration and slowly opening up the world is one of the genres is a 2D side-scroller open world. And that is completely acceptable. There are tons of games like that. There were games like this before Symphony of the Night, Castlevania, but they weren't as popular. I have Ys 3 for my Super Nintendo being played right now, and it's very much so like this. You go around, you explore, you open up worlds based on the stuff you've done and the story you've opened up. But that doesn't mean that it's the only genre. It hasn't been the only one. If you look on the left, you see the original Donkey Kong, and that was a very, very, very beginning of platformers. There were previous platformers to this, but this was the one that really, really made it. And Donkey Kong has a small story. You have kind of this one way to go, though there's openings in other directions. It's kind of a strategic way. And this is a very similar thing to Game Boy games and Game Boy Advance games that you would want to play. In the very next genre, or in the Super Mario Brothers and then Super Mario Brothers 3, you have this single way of running. And you can choose like different paths and how to maneuver and stuff. And it's very, very linear. And people have been making games like that even to this day. During the PlayStation era, they tried to get rid of the side-scroller for the most part. I mean, Castlevania Symphony of the Night was not only a great game, it was also one of the few 2D side-scrollers at all for the PlayStation, let alone the N64, which had like 3, or maybe 10, maybe? But you get the idea. Whereas the Super Nintendo and Nintendo had tons of side-scrollers. They actually had different genres, different clans for their side-scrollers. You didn't just have a platformer where you jumped on enemies. You had games where you slashed characters with swords and it was really difficult, or you do various things, and each one of those kind of creates its own genre. I like to think that Castlevania Symphony of the Night is more like The Legend of Zelda 2, where you have kind of this side-scroller sword fight type game, and you're opening up maneuvers that help you not only fight enemies, but also open up places. And that's more accurate to it because the creators themselves have said that they've referenced Zelda, not Metroid. So that's kind of an interesting thing. Throughout the Game Boy or the PlayStation era, the Game Boy continued making side-scrollers and continued having the different clans within it. Then the Game Boy Advance had more continued to do the clan thing. They had Sonic video games. So did the DS and then the 3DS. They had side-scroller games specifically for people who wanted to play those. And those games sold really, really well. One of the few games that I have seen that have kept their price. Like, a couple years ago, I went into a Best Buy and I found new Super Mario Brothers for the Nintendo DS for sale for $35, brand new. It was still selling at the stores, brand new, even though the DS had gone under, and even though they were selling the 3DS now, and this game was about 10 years old by that time. It was still selling. That should give you an idea of how well this genre works, and how not only this genre or these genres are, but how much people like that clan, or how much this clan works within video game culture. Just because the Metroidvanias are very, very strong in video game culture now doesn't mean that we still don't have clans from the single screen or the side scroller or those other genres. They honestly have clans that fully support them. You can also see this within the console generations, because Nintendo and Super Nintendo had all these side scrollers. So you'll find the clans of those games really supporting the NES and the Super NES and the Sega Genesis, but not so much the PlayStation. And in fact, they'll even kind of talk about the PlayStation like it's not interesting anymore. Like, oh, you got rid of the good games. There's a thing to think about. Okay, so first-person shooters are a major, major tribe, but I can't show you any pictures of them. I have looked. Wikipedia, every picture was majorly copyrighted. Everything I saw was, had this or that, and I was just like, I can't find the right pictures here. But it has been around for a really long time. The first game I played was actually for, I forget what it's called, but it came out in the 80s. It was a Mac, and I think it was like 2 or something, and it was black and white, not green, black and white. And it had the machine actually had a first-person shooter. You literally ran through a maze looking for someone else, and you'd shoot them with a spacebar. And instead of any controls that you can think of, you pointed your mouse in the direction you wanted to go. Like literally, you would watch your mouse, and if it turned into an arrow, that was the direction you would go if you clicked on the mouse. So you want to move left. Oh, make sure your control has a left-pointing arrow. That sounds weird, but that's the way you played the game. And because it was supposed to be a modem type game, I never actually got to understand it very well. I just explored the level. And it was actually just little boxes from that mud, as you can imagine. You just moved forward, and slowly opened up the level. But from there, you have, the rays. The rays are actually a type of programming, and that was a specific style for not only the type of game, but how they programmed it. That was a very specific way to keep everything, not high processing. So they would only show you what you saw. So these rays are literally just little mathematical lines saying, okay, this is within his sight. This will be what he sees. Everything else we will not render. So that all you have is about 325 rays going out, and that means you only have 325 lines or 325 things to draw. And that made things a lot easier to do. And everything else, you knew where the character was, you knew where everything was, but they wouldn't have to be rendered by the processor. And slowly it moved forward, and there is an unofficial thing where the truth is we use architecture all the time for level editing, especially if it's multiplayer. Like, actual architects are involved, but we can't say it out loud. Because if you say it out loud, you get involved with all the school shootings and stuff. The guys who shot up Columbine were beginning level editors. And that was right when mods and stuff were starting to come in. So them being level designers, even if they weren't any good, put a black mark on all level designs. So So game companies will not talk about that. They will not admit to it, even though they'll admit that they look at real world architecture. It isn't until like modern times that they start to admit to it. But even then, each genre, you can see the clan of the Doom Rays, then you can see the Quake kind of 3D feel to it. That's its own genre, that's its own clan, and people who specifically like that. And then you have, the people who like the Half-Life games, and, the people who like the Call of Duty type games. It's very linear, but it tells the story that you really like. And even within there, you have, your own clans on what is and isn't useful. So you can see these clans within the system. I'm sorry I can't show you any pictures. The copyright is just weird for this case, and I apologize for that. So story games are probably not something you were expecting. You haven't thought about it. But a story game is where the entire point of the game is to move forward, and anything else in the game is kind of boring. And it's really kind of interesting because unlike the other tribes where things can get more complex and more difficult, story games have been going in the opposite direction. I think the most interesting ones right now, I can't remember the name of the company. They make Minecraft story and Walking Dead stories and stuff like that, where you just choose, as you're watching this video, you just kind of make a decision, and your decisions slowly change your character and move them in different directions, and that's how the story is told. Everything else is unimportant, and in fact, all you're doing is making decisions. However, that same company will make a different game for a different clan based on games from the old LucasArts and Sierra Online games, where everything was a puzzle to move the story forward, and everybody you talked to was part of that story. The game you're looking at is called Curse of the Monkey Island. Secret of the Monkey Island. And it was a major game. I preferred Maniac Mansion, but this is a great game, and it was always, trying to keep wits with you and telling jokes and letting characters kind of beat themselves up. And all you're doing is you're just trying to move the story forward a little bit by a little bit. And every puzzle is just to move the story forward. And so it's very complex. It has very complex controls. You have to type things in. You have to choose out things, and you have to use specific items in your backpack, and you actually have a limit on what you have in your backpack. And it just gets very complex very quickly. And if you don't know what you're doing, it actually becomes really boring because the story isn't moving forward. I saw this with the Homestar Runner game. If you didn't know what to do, it just got dull because you're just running around as Strong Bad, asking people stuff, and they're giving you the same answer over and over and over again. Well, if we were to play modern games, there's a game called the Walking Simulator, where you're just walking around, looking at stuff, and a story kind of happens. And that is the big, artsy, big show type thing. And it's just you walking around, looking at levels, the level design, and going, oh, there's a story here. And the indie scene really has these story games out a lot, where if you wanted to, you could beat the game in seconds. You really could. But instead, the entire point is to go explore the area and slowly find out more of the story within this set area. Going Home, for example, or Secret of something or other. But there's a lot of games like this. And it's much simpler. If we were to be honest, a lot of the PlayStation games are story games. They're not really there for, the combat or any of that. It's just there to continue the story. The worst offender was released for the PS4, and it's a 3-hour game. It takes you 3 hours to play, and most of it you're not actually playing. You're just watching video. And that's not a joke. And then if you are playing, you're just basically moving from point A to point B. You're shooting up some characters, and then you go back into the story. Like there isn't a major thing for you to do. And if you aren't just moving forward while shooting, you're doing something called a quick time event, which is like, okay, at this moment, press A, okay. And like that's kind of how it goes. Tons of games like this though, and they're all very linear. And the entire point is to just hear the story. And they kind of mix other genres in, but you'll know a story game when you see it. When you're like, okay, I just need to get this item to move this item, just because I want to know the story, and the story is what compels you to move forward. Third-person platformers are interesting because so many different games try to be third-person platformers and aren't around anymore. Castlevania famously has tried different ways to make a great third-person platformer, Castlevania, and has failed. Some of these games are a lot of fun, but they just haven't done as well. Nintendo 64, Castlevania, I really like it, but it just has a couple problems that just make it really, really difficult to play. And that was a major third-person platformer. But the third-person platformer, you can tell by the clan based on how the camera works and by the graphical acuity that you're looking at. But really, the people who move it forward the most are Nintendo. It's kind of Nintendo's thing. And that's not me trying to be mean about it. There aren't a lot of others who do it. Even though this is an incredibly popular genre, and it has a lot of promotion by all of the people who promote games, or by journalists and stuff, these games tend to not sell as well. They tend to not last as long. And especially if you're trying to move from 2D to 3D, it doesn't do so well. The one that has made it the most has been Mario. And it started with Mario 64, and it's basically just this closed box area that you're exploring to find items. And yes, you don't have to get every item, but you kind of want to. And that's the idea, is you could beat the game really fast, or you can continue to explore to find more stuff. But it's very much so a platformer. There's more linear type of platformers. Basically, Nintendo has created different genres for the same Mario, third-person Mario. And every console has had a different kind of style for that. The most recent one, Mario Odyssey, is much more about the box exploration than the versions of Mario for the Wii, where you had kind of this linear path and you were just exploring this linear path to get to where you needed to go. On the other hand, the game I think that is the best of the third-person platformer was the Tony Hawk series. By and far, same idea. You had this closed box area, and you were just trying to get, so many points, or you had this limited amount of time, and you had so much to explore and so much to collect, and you could move forward without collecting everything, but you really wanted to because it made you a little bit more powerful, or got you a new board, or something like that. So it's weird because past a certain point into the PS3 era, they just sort of stopped. And they were just like, we'd rather not. Even though there's tons of clans over the platformers, it's mostly indie now. Jack and Daxter, I think, are still around. No, not Jack and Daxter. The other one. Ratchet and Clank. There we go. Same people make it, so you can imagine my confusion. And they kind of treat it like a kiddie thing, and there aren't a lot of things like this. If you go and you do kind of a shooter, it's a very linear game, and frankly, it becomes more of a story game. It's kind of a mixture between a story game and a brawler or a shooter. And you have, Gears of War, which is a very tactical third-person game, or you have God of War style games where you beat up characters and then you have to do this little quick time event, and it's pretty much story entirely. But those are major things that Castlevania tried to make a God of War, and it was a cool game, but you only wanted to play it once, and that was the problem. So third-person platformer, it's really interesting because there's clans, but not as big, even though there should be. Know what I mean? Driving games have the most interesting of clans because a lot of the clans have disappeared and no one cares. For instance, driving games have been around since the bygone days, before video games. You know, they had racing games before there really were computers that could build anything. They would just have this little platform that was moving and have cars in the way, and you just had to dodge them. And that's the speedway on the left. And actually, there were games even into the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s, that were driving games, and people enjoyed them. And, you know, we're trying to get this little dot around the area, so we got to turn to get it around. And almost all of those genres are gone. They don't exist anymore. And yet, they're a lot of fun, and there's still people who are like, oh yeah, you know, I wish there was a game like this. Another one is top-down racers. There's a couple games like that. There are, but really they're not around. The last major game where you were top-down and racing was Grand Theft Auto 2. And that was released for the PlayStation. There just aren't a lot. And that's a kind of a weird thing. The same goes for racing games. You know, if you played the Gran Turismo, you only want Gran Turismo type games. That's it. Crazy Taxi will not interest you. Speaking of which, you can actually tell the clan based on the controls. Like the Crazy Taxi controls for the Dreamcast have very specific ways of acceleration and deceleration or braking. And that is how you play with certain games, and they work that same way. You hit brakes, and then slowly you start backing up. The Gran Turismo type games, they have a different way to control, and it actually gets confusing at times. If you've been playing Gran Turismo for a while, you have to go over to the Crazy Taxi controls, and you get confused. That doesn't mean that it's not going to be simulation-like in the same way as the other games, but it does confuse you a bit because there's two controls. And honestly, one control I truly believe is more, how shall I say it, arcadey. And that's an interesting thing, is the arcade type racer is still around. It's very much so a clan. You'll still find it everywhere. Major game throughout the things. And then, you know, you will have the Mario Kart clan. Huge clan. And you have to realize how big the driving tribe is. The PlayStation 1's top-selling game was Gran Turismo. The PlayStation 2's top-selling game was Grand Theft Auto, which had driving in it. So you have to realize exactly how big these games are. The same thing for the Xbox One. One of their top-selling games was actually a driving game. Oh, I actually own it. This is terrible. I feel like I should go and look at it right now, but it's a good game. I like it. I just haven't played it in a while, because it's very, very similar to Gran Turismo. And that's the thing, is they're all trying to get this clan because it's a huge clan, and it's actually really easy to sell to the driving clan. You just make everything look nice on a really linear system. Mario Kart is more cartoony, more slidey, more twisty. Then you go into the arcade games, which go a little bit, you know, one way or the other, but aren't as over the top as Mario Kart. And then you go into the more simulation games like Gran Turismo. Oh man, now it's killing me that I can't remember that game. But the interesting part about selling these games is you just have to make them look nice. And that's really easy since it's a linear path. It's a very simplified path, and you only have to view it from a certain angle. For instance, the angle you're looking at, all you're looking at is from one little square box, and that's it. You're not going to go explore this city, so all the buildings that you won't be able to see just aren't made. But they're trying to, you know, they add all of this extra graphical things because, you know, they can, and there's not a lot of stuff stopping you. It's a fascinating thing. One of the more annoying parts about driving games is they have rubber band physics, or rubber band AI, which means that if you are winning, they'll have the AI kind of catch up with you. Or if you're catching up with certain people in the lead, they'll suddenly start moving faster than they really could beforehand. Like you're going 200 miles per hour and somehow they're going 210, even though that car can't go that speed. And that's really annoying. Sorry. There's actually some levels that are next to impossible to get in first in Gran Turismo 6. Just saying. But that's the thing is it looks nice, and because they know that they can do this in iterations, they can actually sell you the new console by showing you the new iteration of this clan. Kind of a cool thing, don't you think? Then we have the sports games, and once again, you have the Mario games, which are very cartoony, and then you have kind of very simplified games like the ones for Atari or the ones for NES, and you actually can tell how they're played based on where the camera is placed. For football games, American football games, your character will always be in front of the camera your camera will always be behind them, looking at their back. Whereas if you're playing regular football games, it's kind of up and to the side. But you can just look at the characters and know how this game is going to be played. Will it be played with a simplified system, with over-the-top controls and stuff, or will it be more, simulations, like in the same way as the driving games? And these are a major, major clan. Major clan. Madden is one of the top-selling console or games for PlayStation and Xbox. And Nintendo has had to make their own sports games to grab that clan. Yes, they're more cartoony, but that doesn't mean that they can't be solid games as well. And these are major sports games, or these are major clans. And you can kind of see how they slowly move forward in the same way as driving, You see the left, and it's very blocky. And here's the interesting part. Some people still make games like those blocky games. Oh, what is it? Super Bowl or Super something? Namco Bowl or something like that. Still sold to this day, and people still love it, even though it's just kind of a simplified sports game. People just like it. The first people who ran EA, I can't remember his name, but he actually owned Electronic Arts and tried to make the 3DO. He wanted to make Madden, and he wanted to make sports games, and everybody was like, dude, this isn't making a lot of major, inroads. Why are you into this? And he's like, no, this is going to be big. Once it sells right, we're going to be huge. And he was right. He makes billions of dollars off of that. Well, he doesn't. EA does. He was actually kicked out of EA because the 3DO didn't do too well. But that's the thing, is sports games are this huge clan, and we just don't realize it when you're from the platformer clan or from the platformer tribe or from the story tribe. You look at these games and you're just like, what the heck is that? Why are you buying the same game every year? It makes no sense. In fact, this has influenced other tribes. You'll now get a new shooter or army shooter every year. Call of Duty, boom. Medal of Honor, boom. Such and such, boom. Every year. They tried to do that with Tony Hawk until Tony Hawk could sell no more. And that's really sad because near the end, it wasn't Tony Hawk anymore. It was just some weird, badly angled, kind of dark, really bad game. I know, I just bought one of those games and I'm just like, wow, this isn't very fun. This isn't Tony Hawk. So it's an interesting thing. We have these influencers from other tribes going into these third-person platformers and other stuff. And sometimes it creates its own kind of tribal, intertribal clan, and sometimes it's just awful. And you kind of see that. And this is the last slide. So next week we're going to be talking about controls. It's going to be all week, and I'm not joking. Controls can make its own tribe, and you can sort of follow the timeline of history following just controls. So I just wanted you to know that, and thank you very much. Let's see how this goes. Bye now.